So this is wage determination part 2, and we're going to look at what happens when we don't have these perfectly competitive labour markets. So it looks like a lot of stuff, and it is quite difficult, but let's see how you get along. So just to make it very clear the difference between a perfect labour market and an imperfect labour market. So in a perfect labour market, there's perfect knowledge. Think of the characteristics of perfect competition. They're very, very similar when we're looking at kind of perfect competition. We're thinking about firms selling things to perfect labour markets when small firms are buying in small amounts of labour. So there's perfect knowledge in the market, so everyone's aware of the job opportunities that are out there. There's perfect mobility of labour, and this is between jobs in the same industry, between jobs in different industries. This is geographically, and there are no costs in hiring and firing workers. A lot of these are very unrealistic if you know about businesses, because human resources or personnel departments, they're going to be very an important part of any business, and businesses spend money on them because it's important. Your human capital, your workers. All workers and employees are price takers. So this is where we saw that the individual firm faced a perfectly elastic supply curve for labour. There's no barriers that prevent wages rising and falling according to changes in demand and supply. And firms aim to maximise profit and minimise cost of production. Workers aim to maximise their wages. We'll see this in imperfect labour markets as well, but sometimes employees are willing to forgo certain wages if they get a lot of job satisfaction from them. But other economists would just view that as a kind of non-monetary benefit that you could put a monetary value on. But essentially, all of these characteristics of perfect labour markets mean that, in theory, all workers should be paid the same wage, regardless of where they're working and the occupation that they work in, which we know is very, very unrealistic. So, imperfect labour markets are here. Well, the ones that we've got to study are three types of imperfect labour markets. So either where the firm is dominant or a monopoly buyer of labour, so we call that a monopsonist, or where the firm is faced by a monopoly supplier of labour. Now, we don't usually refer to them as that, but that's really what a trade union is. When they engage, they have members who are employees, and they engage in collective bargaining, and they won't accept below, the trade union standard wage rate. Or we can have situations where we have both of those things occurring. Okay. So here's our perfect labour market, and then along comes a trade union, or it would actually be the same diagram for a minimum wage, and we've set it above the equilibrium wage. Now, the effect that this has on the market is that we get this distinction between the quantity demanded by the firm of labour and the quantity supplied. So this is the amount of labour that employees are willing to supply. So the difference between here and here is that we're getting excess supply of labour. So the wage rate has increased up to here, so we've seen this increase, but unfortunately we've actually caused unemployment in the market, because here was where we were employing people, but increasing the wage rate has actually caused a bit of unemployment. It's reduced the amount of labour that's demanded in the market. So it doesn't sound so great, does it, when you introduce the minimum wage or when you introduce a trade union? However, what can happen is this: demand can shift outwards. You might think, why would demand shift outwards? And you've got to think back to this equation here: marginal revenue times marginal product. And it's mainly going to be to do with this marginal product here. So we might actually find that trade unions increase productivity. And the way that they can do that is because they can provide training, which training should increase productivity. They also can offer advice as well to the employees, so that takes a bit of the burden of the human resource costs off the firm. They can help implement changes as well. Very often when they get wages agreed to or new wage levels by the employer might say, okay, but you've got to help us implement this change, and so they can help facilitate that and hold talks and meetings and really explain things through to their members and get them on side. And they also engage in collective bargaining. So rather than the employer bargain individually with each employee, which would take time and resources, they can collectively bargain with the employer, and this should save money, save time, and get a wage rate agreed to. Okay, so we might find that it actually increases employment as well as increasing the wage rate, which looks really good on that diagram. Okay, one question that students often have is they say to me, well, how far up above the normal equilibrium, the first equilibrium even, do I draw this line here? What would make it go up here? What would make it go down here? Okay, oh, well, that was a bit of a wonky line here. There we go, a bit better. And it's the bargaining strength of the trade unions. So some things that can determine it are trade union membership and militancy. So the more members they have, it tends to have the more power, and the more willing that they are to go on to go and strike and hold industrial action, the more power they have, because the more financial hardship and negative consequences they can inflict on the employer. So they tend to have more power. This one's less intuitive. So the more inelastic demand is for labour, the smaller the reduction in employment and the smaller the effect on the trade union. Now I'm going to go back and just explain it using this diagram. And it's all getting a little bit messy now, but if I choose another colour, hopefully you'll be able to see it. So I'll go for a light blue here. So rather than this demand curve that I'm looking at here being like that, what if it was like this? Whoops. That's the demand. So it's more inelastic. So we've gone, it was meant to go through this point here, sorry, but we've gone from this point, and with the increase in the wage, actually demand for labour would fall by a smaller amount. So they're more likely, the trade union, to negotiate for a higher wage increase if the demand curve for labour is more inelastic, because they know they're going to lose fewer members than they would have done had the demand curve for labour been elastic. And also the profitability of the employer, this one's more intuitive, so the more profitable the employer is, the more likely they are to give pay rises. So this is where we have a monopsonist buyer of labour. So the monopsonist is the market. So we've got the supply curve for labour here, but because they're facing an upwards sloping supply curve, the marginal cost is going to diverge from this supply curve. And we know that profit is maximised where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So we've got marginal cost here, and it's going to meet marginal revenue or marginal revenue product at this point here. So this is going to be the labour, and if you're employing that amount of people, this is going to be the cost of labour. Okay, so that's going to be the wage of the monopsonist. So if we introduce a minimum wage or we introduce a trade union, what happens? Oh, sorry, first of all, let's compare it to the competitive equilibrium. So this would be the amount of people employed in market where demand equals supply, and that's the competitive equilibrium. So if we introduce a minimum wage or we introduce a trade union, what happens is we get this funny kind of sloping curve now. So they're not willing to accept below this level. I'm going to put it wage trade union. They're not willing to accept below that level, and then you get a kind of disconnect with this dotted line, and then upwards the monopolist goes back to choosing the amount of labour they employ based on the marginal cost. So if demand did move out here, you know, you'd be working off this kind of level here, and this would be the wage level here. But the trade union, none of their members are willing to accept below that rate there, that green line there. Okay, so in that case, we've got a higher wage than we would have got in both of the competitive market and the monopsonist when they're just operating without the trade union. But it does depend upon the strength of the trade union, because if this trade union weren't very strong and they'd been able to negotiate level, you'd see that the wage is actually lower than the competitive market. But this is the amount of demand. Actually, they're employing less than a competitive market would have employed, but more than the monopsonists making the decisions on their own would have employed. So, you know, higher wages for the employees, that's good news for them, and there's more people employed, but when you're comparing it to the competitive position, it would have been even more people employed in the competitive position. Now, I've drawn a diagram there where the trade union has quite a bit of power. This would be a diagram where the trade union doesn't have as much power. So I've just this would be the monopsonist level of employment, monopsonist wage. If they don't have very much power, I'll draw a line here. They've pushed the wage up, so it's a decent amount of power, but it's not getting anywhere near to what the competitive level would be. And that's the there we go. So should just be marginal cost there. So we see the wage with the trade union, and that's what the diagram's looking like.